"You're homeless now, Mom," my daughter said, smiling as if she were commenting on the weather, and for a moment I honestly thought I had misheard her. The dining room was warm with the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon sweet potatoes. The long oak table set with the china I had polished myself that morning, each place card written in my careful script. Outside the tall windows, December snow drifted lazily over the quiet suburban street in Franklin Park, just outside Columbus, Ohio. Inside, my family laughed, glasses clinked, forks tapped against plates, and life went on as though nothing extraordinary had just been said. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap because they had begun to tremble, and I had no intention of letting anyone see that. At 71, a woman learns the value of stillness. I turned my head slowly toward Linda, my only daughter, noticing how perfectly her blonde hair was curled, how the diamond studs in her ears caught the light from the chandelier I had chosen 20 years ago when her father and I first renovated this house. She was cutting her turkey into small, precise bites, the same methodical way she had approached everything since childhood. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, forcing my voice to remain steady. "What did you just say?" She dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin and finally met my eyes. There was no anger there, no hesitation, only a kind of polished impatience, as if she were explaining something obvious to someone who had fallen behind. "The house, Mom," she replied. "It's not yours anymore. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay." Around us, conversation softened but did not stop. My son-in-law continued describing his new SUV. The grandchildren kept arguing over cranberry sauce, and the television murmured faintly from the living room where a football game flickered across the screen. I became aware of the ticking of the antique wall clock, each second striking like a small, precise hammer. This house had been my anchor since my husband, Robert, died 5 years earlier. Every creaking floorboard held a memory. Every window framed a piece of the life we had built together. I had trusted Linda to help me manage paperwork after the funeral, trusted her to explain the endless envelopes from insurance companies and county offices, trusted her when she said she would take care of everything. Trust, I realized in that moment, could be the most expensive gift a mother ever gave. "There must be some mistake," I murmured, though even as the words left my mouth, I sensed the hollow space opening beneath them. Linda gave a soft laugh, the kind she used at charity luncheons when someone said something mildly foolish. "There's no mistake. I handled the sale months ago. You signed the authorization forms, remember?" I searched my memory for those papers. There had been so many documents back then. My vision blurred with grief, my hands aching from arthritis, my heart still stunned by the sudden quiet of widowhood. I had signed wherever she pointed, grateful not to face the bureaucracy alone. The realization spread through me like winter cold seeping under a door. I looked down at the tablecloth, noticing a faint stain from last year's red wine spill that I had never quite managed to remove. Strange, the details a mind clings to when the ground begins to shift. "Why would you sell my home?" I asked. My voice sounded distant, as if someone else were speaking through me. Linda shrugged lightly. "It was too much for you. The maintenance, the taxes. You've been struggling, and honestly, it's more practical this way." Practical. The word hovered between us like an accusation. I thought of the mornings I had woken before dawn to pack her school lunches, the nights I had stayed up sewing Halloween costumes by hand, the years I had worked double shifts at the library after Robert's heart attack so we could keep this very house. Practical had never been part of motherhood. Sacrifice had. Devotion had. Love had. I lifted my gaze and studied my daughter's face, searching for some flicker of the little girl who once clutched my hand crossing busy streets. She was gone. In her place sat a poised, successful real estate consultant who believed she had solved a problem. I straightened my shoulders, smoothing the front of my navy dress. "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked. Linda's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the snow-covered lawn that would soon belong to strangers. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," she said. In that instant, the laughter around the table sounded unbearably loud. I reached for my water glass and took a careful sip, giving myself time to think, to breathe, to remember that storms were survived not by shouting at the wind but by choosing where to stand. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply nodded, as if she had told me something entirely ordinary. But deep inside, beneath the layers of shock and sorrow, another memory began to stir. A boy with dark hair and frightened eyes standing on my front porch 30 years ago, clutching a torn backpack and asking if he could stay just one night. I had opened my door to him without hesitation. Now, as snow continued to fall outside the house that was no longer mine, I wondered if he might be the only person left in this world who still remembered what I had done. I stayed at the table until the last plate had been cleared, listening to the familiar rhythm of family conversation that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Linda began discussing spring vacation plans in Florida, mentioning beachfront rentals and golf packages, while my son-in-law calculated flight prices on his phone. My grandson spilled cranberry juice across the tablecloth and everyone laughed as if it were the most important event of the evening. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and noticed that my wedding ring felt unusually heavy against my finger. I had not removed it since Robert passed, even though the doctor once suggested my joints might feel better without it. Some weights I had learned were worth carrying. When I finally stood up, no one asked where I was going. I moved through the hallway of the house with quiet steps, trailing my fingers along the wall where Linda's childhood height marks were still penciled in faint graphite lines. Age 7, age 10, age 16. Each line a promise I believed we had made to each other without words. The guest bedroom was dim and cold, the thermostat set lower than I preferred to save on heating costs. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, staring at the suitcase tucked in the corner from my last visit. Something inside me understood that it would not be unpacked again. That night, after the laughter faded and the house settled into its usual creaks and sighs, I lay awake counting the seconds between the ticking of the hallway clock. At 3 o'clock in the morning I rose quietly, wrapped a wool shawl around my shoulders, and walked into the kitchen. The moonlight reflected off the stainless steel sink I had insisted on installing during the renovation years ago. I remembered how Robert had teased me about wanting something so modern in a house built in 1968. He had said it would outlast us both. He had been right. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and carried it into the living room, lowering myself into the leather armchair that still held the faint scent of his cologne. The silence there was different now. Not peaceful. Not comforting. It felt like a room waiting for new owners to decide what to keep and what to throw away. I tried to replay every conversation Linda and I had shared over the past year, searching for the moment when my home had quietly stopped being mine. There had been missed phone calls from the county clerk's office, letters that never seemed to reach my mailbox, bank statements she offered to review for me because she said I deserved to rest. I had believed her. Mothers were trained to believe their children even when logic suggested otherwise. The furnace kicked on with a low mechanical hum and warm air brushed against my ankles. I realized suddenly that I did not know how long I would be allowed to stay here. Days perhaps. Weeks if I was fortunate. Practical decisions had already been made on my behalf. My life reduced to a set of signatures and polite explanations. I set my empty cup on the coffee table and noticed a framed photograph beside it. It showed a much younger version of myself standing on the front porch with a thin boy whose shoes were clearly 2 sizes too big. Ethan had been 12 then, all sharp elbows and wary glances, but he had smiled for that picture as if he had just discovered the possibility of belonging. I traced the edge of the frame with my fingertip, remembering the first night he slept on our living room sofa wrapped in one of Robert's old quilts. We had told him he could stay as long as he needed. He had stayed for 6 years. The memory steadied my breathing in a way nothing else had managed since dinner. Outside, a snowplow rumbled down the street, clearing a path that would soon fill again with fresh white powder. Life continued whether we were ready or not. I rose and walked back toward the staircase, pausing halfway up to look down at the house that had witnessed every triumph and heartbreak of my adult life. I did not feel anger yet, only a quiet, growing clarity. Somewhere far beyond this silent suburban street, a man I once sheltered was building an empire. And for the first time since my daughter told me I was homeless, I began to consider what it might mean to finally ask for something in return. I did not sleep the next morning. Instead, I dressed before sunrise in the same quiet routine that had guided me through decades of ordinary days, choosing a wool skirt and a pale gray sweater that Robert once said made me look dignified. The house felt different with the daylight creeping through the blinds, as if it had already begun to detach itself from me. I moved slowly through each room, pausing to touch the back of a dining chair, the polished edge of the piano, the brass handle of the front door that had welcomed so many guests over the years. Every object seemed to hold a memory that now hovered just beyond my reach. In the kitchen I prepared oatmeal and black coffee, measuring the water and oats with the same precision I had taught Linda when she was learning to cook. She used to stand on a wooden stool beside me, her small hands gripping a spoon like it was an important instrument. I wondered when she had stopped needing guidance and started making decisions without me. The sound of footsteps upstairs broke my thoughts. Linda entered the kitchen wearing a tailored blazer and holding her phone to her ear, speaking in brisk tones about closing dates and inspection reports. She nodded at me politely as she poured herself orange juice, covering the mouthpiece with her hand. There was no trace of discomfort in her expression, no shadow of doubt. "Good morning," she said when the call ended. "I hope you slept well." I studied her face for a long moment before answering. "I have been thinking," I replied carefully, "about the house." She exhaled as if she had expected resistance and was relieved to hear calm instead. "It really is for the best. The buyers are planning to stop by this afternoon with their realtor. It would help if you were out for a few hours." The words landed softly but carried the weight of finality. Out for a few hours. As if I were a visitor whose presence might complicate a transaction. I nodded once, committing her request to memory. After breakfast I put on my coat and stepped outside into the crisp Ohio air. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked down the driveway, noticing how the maple tree Robert planted the year Linda was born had grown tall enough to cast long shadows across the lawn. The neighborhood was waking slowly. A dog barked in the distance. A school bus hissed to a stop at the corner. Life unfolded with quiet indifference to personal upheaval. I drove without a clear destination, letting instinct guide me through familiar streets lined with modest ranch houses and tidy mailboxes. Eventually I found myself in the parking lot of the public library, where I had worked for nearly 30 years. The building looked unchanged, its brick facade warmed by the pale winter sun. Inside, the scent of paper and floor polish wrapped around me like an old friend. I wandered between the shelves, running my fingers along the spines of novels I had once recommended to strangers seeking comfort or escape. It struck me then that I had spent most of my life helping others find their way while never imagining I might one day be lost. I sat at a wooden reading table and stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. The device felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the gravity of a decision waiting to be made. Ethan's name was not stored in my contacts. I had memorized it years ago, afraid that writing it down might somehow weaken the quiet pride I felt watching his success from a distance. For a long time I simply held the phone in both hands, listening to the muted rustle of turning pages around me. Memories surfaced with surprising clarity. The afternoon he won a statewide scholarship. The night he packed his bags for college and promised he would make us proud. The Christmas card he sent every year without fail, signed in careful handwriting that had once been shaky with uncertainty. Outside the library windows clouds gathered, dimming the light. I realized that waiting would not restore what had already been taken, nor would silence protect me from the consequences of trust misplaced. With a steady breath I unlocked the phone and began to dial a number I had not called in more than a decade, aware that somewhere across the country a man who owed his future to a stranger's kindness might soon hear a voice from his past asking for help. The call connected on the third ring. I almost ended it before anyone answered, my finger hovering over the screen as doubt pressed against my resolve. Then a familiar voice, deeper now but unmistakably calm, filled my ear. "This is Ethan Brooks." For a moment I could not speak. I had imagined this conversation countless times over the years, rehearsed polite greetings and casual updates. Yet now that the moment had arrived, all of my carefully arranged words scattered like snow caught in sudden wind. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of his breathing at the other end of the line. "Ethan," I said at last, my voice quieter than I intended. There was a brief silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath that carried recognition and something warmer. "Margaret? Is that really you?" The way he said my name made time fold inward on itself. I was back on the porch of our old house, handing a frightened boy a bowl of soup and promising him he was safe. I straightened my shoulders, reminding myself why I had called. "Yes. I hope I am not interrupting your day." A soft chuckle reached me, rich with confidence. "You could never interrupt me. I have been hoping you would call someday." I glanced around the quiet reading room of the library, suddenly aware of how far his world must be from this modest space filled with worn wooden tables and fluorescent lights. Through the tall windows I could see gray clouds thickening, the promise of another snowfall drifting across the sky. I would not have reached out if it were not important, I continued. Something has happened. I told him the story slowly, choosing each word with care. I spoke of documents I had signed without fully understanding them, of a house sold in my absence, of being asked to step aside while strangers measured the walls that once held my family's laughter. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply described facts as they had unfolded. When I finished, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I wondered if I had burdened him with a problem he did not need. Then he spoke again, his tone measured and decisive. "Where are you right now?" "At the public library on Maple Avenue," I replied. I wanted somewhere quiet to think. I heard the faint tapping of keys, the muted hum of what I imagined was a spacious office far removed from my small town. "Stay there," he said gently. "I am arranging a car to pick you up. We will figure this out together." His certainty steadied me more than any reassurance could have. For the first time since Linda's announcement at dinner, I felt the fragile edge of hope pressing through the fog of confusion. "You do not need to go to such trouble," I began, but he interrupted with unexpected firmness. "You once opened your door to me when you had every reason to turn away. Allow me to do the same." I lowered the phone slowly after we ended the call, my reflection wavering in the darkened screen. Around me, patrons continued reading, unaware that the trajectory of my life had just shifted in a quiet corner between shelves of history and fiction. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, soft and relentless. I sat very still, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Practical solutions would come later. For now, it was enough to know that I was not entirely alone. When I finally rose from the table, I felt a curious lightness in my step, as though the weight of betrayal had been redistributed into something sharper and more purposeful. Whatever awaited me beyond the library doors, I sensed that the next chapter would not be written by silence or resignation, but by a long overdue reckoning that had begun with a single phone call. I waited near the tall front windows of the library, watching the snowfall thicken until the streetlights flickered on despite the early afternoon hour. Time seemed to stretch in unfamiliar ways, each passing minute marked by the soft turning of pages and the distant echo of footsteps across polished tile. I wondered what kind of car Ethan would send. The thought felt strangely unreal, as though I were anticipating a scene from someone else's life. When the vehicle finally pulled up to the curb, it did not announce itself with noise or extravagance. It simply arrived, a sleek black sedan gliding through the white haze with quiet precision. A man in a dark overcoat stepped inside and approached the circulation desk, speaking briefly with the librarian before walking toward me. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked with courteous certainty. I nodded, gathering my purse and the wool shawl draped over my shoulders. The warmth inside the car enveloped me as the driver closed the door, sealing out the winter air and the last fragments of hesitation that had followed me all morning. We drove through streets that gradually widened into highways, the familiar neighborhoods giving way to towering glass buildings and carefully manicured office parks. I sat upright in the back seat, my hands folded in my lap, studying the passing landscape as if committing it to memory. It occurred to me that I had spent years living within a radius of 10 miles, my world defined by grocery stores, church pews, and library shelves. Now that circle was expanding at a pace I could barely comprehend. When we stopped in front of a high-rise office complex with polished steel doors and a lobby that gleamed like a museum, I felt a flicker of uncertainty rise within me. The driver opened my door and offered his arm. Inside, the scent of fresh flowers and expensive coffee filled the air. People moved quickly across marble floors, their voices low and purposeful. A receptionist with impeccable posture smiled and directed me toward a private elevator that ascended in near silence. I watched the numbers climb, aware that each floor represented a world I had never imagined entering. The doors opened to a spacious office framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Ethan stood there, taller than I remembered, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression softening the moment he saw me. For an instant neither of us moved. Then he crossed the room in long strides and took my hands in his. "You should not have had to face this alone," he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice dissolved the final barrier I had been holding in place since the night Linda spoke those words at dinner. I felt the familiar steadiness return, the same calm resolve that had guided me through widowhood and years of quiet endurance. We sat together at a polished conference table while he listened once more to every detail, asking precise questions about dates, signatures, and property records. His assistants moved discreetly in the background, placing folders before him and tapping notes into tablets. It was a choreography of competence that both impressed and unsettled me. When he finally leaned back in his chair, there was a glint of determination in his eyes that reminded me of the boy who once refused to give up on a difficult math problem until he found the answer. "There are things we can do," he said. "Legal things. Practical things. But first, you will stay somewhere comfortable tonight." He arranged accommodations in a quiet hotel overlooking the river, insisting I treat it as a temporary refuge rather than an indulgence. As evening settled over the city, I stood by the window of my room watching lights flicker on in hundreds of apartments stacked like luminous boxes against the dark. Somewhere miles away, my daughter was likely guiding strangers through the rooms of my former home, discussing square footage and resale value. I felt no urge to call her. The time for explanations had passed. Instead, I placed my hands against the cool glass and allowed a new understanding to take shape within me. Betrayal had stripped away the illusion of permanence, but it had also revealed an unexpected path forward. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and perhaps consequences none of us could yet foresee. Tonight, I allowed myself the rare luxury of stillness, knowing that for the first time in many years, I was no longer navigating the future entirely on my own. I woke before dawn to the unfamiliar hush of a luxury hotel room, the heavy curtains muting the first pale hints of morning. For a moment I did not remember where I was, and then the events of the past 2 days returned with startling clarity. The high ceiling, the crisp white sheets, the faint hum of distant traffic far below the window all reminded me that my life had shifted onto a path I had never planned. I rose slowly and walked to the glass, watching the city awaken in quiet increments. Commuters moved like purposeful shadows across sidewalks dusted with new snow. A river of headlights streamed along the expressway, each car carrying someone toward a destination they had chosen. I wondered when I had last felt that sense of direction. The telephone on the bedside table rang precisely at 7 o'clock. Ethan's voice was steady, already immersed in the rhythm of his day. He asked if I had rested, if the room was comfortable, if I had eaten. The questions felt both practical and deeply personal, a reflection of the boy who once measured security in small gestures of care. "There will be a meeting this morning," he explained. "My legal team has reviewed the preliminary details. They believe there may have been irregularities in the transfer of your property." I listened without interruption, absorbing each word as though it were a stepping stone across uncertain ground. After we ended the call, I dressed carefully, choosing the same navy coat I had worn to church the previous Sunday. Familiar clothing provided a sense of continuity that the circumstances themselves did not. Downstairs, the hotel restaurant offered a breakfast buffet arranged with meticulous elegance. I selected oatmeal, fresh berries, and a cup of black coffee, carrying my tray to a quiet table by the window. The taste of warm food steadied my thoughts. Around me, business travelers checked their watches and typed messages into sleek devices, their conversations punctuated by the language of contracts and deadlines. I realized that for the first time in many years, I was not merely observing life from the sidelines. I was being drawn into decisions that would shape my future in tangible ways. A car arrived promptly at 8:30, delivering me back to Ethan's office where a conference room had been prepared with documents neatly arranged in orderly stacks. The attorneys greeted me with professional courtesy, their expressions serious yet reassuring. They spoke of timelines, disclosures, and the importance of informed consent. Terms I had once found intimidating now felt like tools I could learn to use. Ethan sat beside me throughout the discussion, occasionally clarifying a point or asking for additional verification. His presence was not overwhelming but grounding, like the steady beam of a lighthouse guiding a vessel through fog. When they presented copies of the signed authorization forms, I recognized my own handwriting, fragile and uncertain across the pages. The realization stirred a complex mixture of regret and resolve. I had trusted too easily. Yet trust, I reminded myself, had never been a weakness when offered in good faith. It became harmful only when exploited. As the meeting concluded, one of the attorneys explained that a formal review could potentially delay the final transfer of ownership, providing an opportunity to examine whether I had been misled about the nature of the documents. The prospect of reclaiming control over my circumstances did not ignite triumph. Instead, it brought a quiet sense of balance, as though a scale long tilted had begun to right itself. Later that afternoon, Ethan suggested a short walk along the riverfront to clear our minds. The cold air sharpened my awareness of each step, the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes echoing softly against the water's edge. We spoke not only of legal strategies but of memories that had bound our lives together in ways neither of us had fully acknowledged until now. He told me about the nights he had studied by the light of a borrowed desk lamp in our spare bedroom, about the confidence he had drawn from knowing someone believed in him without condition. I listened, feeling the distance between past and present narrow with every word. When we returned to the warmth of the car, I understood that the coming days would demand courage I had not anticipated needing at this stage of my life. Yet beneath the uncertainty lay an unexpected clarity. The home I had lost might be recoverable. The relationships that had fractured might never be the same. But the strength to move forward, I realized, had been within me all along, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer serve as protection but as the quiet foundation of decisive action. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided there would be no more room for hesitation. I sat at the small writing desk in my hotel room reviewing the documents Ethan's legal team had prepared, each page marked with discrete tabs and notes written in neat, precise handwriting. Sunlight filtered through the tall window, illuminating dust motes that drifted slowly in the still air. It occurred to me that for years I had allowed important decisions to pass through my life like those silent particles present but barely acknowledged. Now every detail demanded my full attention. At 9 o'clock sharp, Ethan knocked gently before entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The gesture was simple yet unexpectedly comforting. "Today we'll move quickly," he said, placing 1 cup before me. "There will be calls, confirmations, perhaps resistance." I nodded, feeling a steadiness settle over me that I had not known I possessed. Together we drove toward a downtown office building where a temporary conference space had been reserved for a meeting with the real estate firm that had facilitated the sale of my home. The drive was quiet, punctuated only by the soft murmur of morning news on the radio, and the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers clearing a light drizzle. When we arrived, the receptionist guided us into a glass-walled room overlooking a busy intersection. Cars streamed past in orderly lanes, each driver intent on reaching a destination that felt certain. Inside, uncertainty gathered like static. Linda was already seated at the far end of the table when we entered. Her posture was impeccable, her expression composed, yet there was a flicker in her eyes I had never seen before. Surprise perhaps, or the first hint of unease. She rose slowly as I approached, her gaze shifting briefly to Ethan, who offered a courteous nod. "Mom," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "I did not expect to see you here." I took the seat opposite her, smoothing my gloves across the polished surface. "There are many things we did not expect this week," I replied softly. The attorneys began outlining their concerns with professional clarity, referencing clauses and timelines that had been overlooked or presented in ways that might have influenced my consent. Linda listened without interruption, her fingers tapping lightly against a folder embossed with her company's logo. I watched her closely, searching for traces of the child I had once comforted after nightmares, the teenager who had confided her hopes and fears in whispered late-night conversations. She seemed both familiar and entirely distant, as though success had placed an invisible pane of glass between us. When it was her turn to speak, she defended her decisions with practiced eloquence, insisting that she had acted in my best interest, that the market conditions had been favorable, that the responsibility of maintaining a large property had become too great for me alone. Her words were logical, efficient, almost persuasive. Yet beneath their polished surface I sensed an urgency that betrayed her confidence. I realized then that power did not always announce itself through raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it emerged quietly, through the simple act of being present and informed. As the discussion continued, Ethan remained mostly silent, his role less about confrontation and more about balance. His presence altered the atmosphere in subtle, but undeniable ways, shifting the conversation from assumption to accountability. When the meeting finally concluded with an agreement to pause the final transfer pending further review, Linda gathered her papers with brisk determination. For a fleeting moment our eyes met across the table. I did not see hostility there. Only the dawning awareness that the narrative she had constructed was no longer entirely under her control. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the pavement glistening under a pale winter sun. I stepped onto the sidewalk and drew a long breath of cold air, feeling the weight of uncertainty transform into something sharper, more purposeful. The future remained unresolved, yet for the first time since that evening at the dinner table, I sensed that the outcome would not be dictated by silence alone. Somewhere within me a quiet resolve had taken root, steady and unyielding, guiding me toward whatever came next. The following days unfolded with a quiet intensity that left little room for reflection. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled. Phone calls threaded through the hours like an invisible current pulling everything forward. I found myself moving through unfamiliar corridors of law offices and financial institutions, guided by Ethan's steady presence and the calm efficiency of his advisors. Each conversation revealed another detail that had once been hidden from me. Signatures that had been obtained during moments of grief. Explanations that had been simplified to the point of distortion. Timelines that suggested urgency where patience might have protected me. I listened carefully, asking questions when I needed clarity, no longer embarrassed by the admission that I had not fully understood before. In the evenings, I returned to the quiet hotel room overlooking the river, removing my gloves and coat with deliberate motions, as though shedding the weight of the day piece by piece. The city lights shimmered on the water like distant promises. One night, as I stood there watching reflections ripple across the surface, my phone vibrated softly in my hand. Linda's name appeared on the screen. For a long moment I did not answer. The silence between us had become its own language, filled with unspoken truths. When I finally accepted the call, her voice carried a strain I had never heard before. "Mom, we need to talk," she said. I did not respond immediately. Instead I let her words settle, measuring their sincerity. "We are already talking," I replied at last. She exhaled audibly, as though releasing a burden she had been carrying alone. She spoke of pressure from clients, of deadlines that had narrowed her perspective, of the belief that simplifying my life would somehow protect me from future hardship. I listened without interruption, aware that explanations did not erase consequences. Outside, a siren wailed briefly before fading into the distance. The world continued its restless motion, while we confronted the stillness of our shared history. "I thought you would understand," she admitted quietly. The sentence lingered in the air between us. Understanding had always been my instinct. Forgiveness had often followed without being asked. Yet something within me had shifted. "Perhaps I will in time," I said. "But first I need to understand myself." After we ended the call, I sat at the small desk and opened the folder Ethan's attorneys had provided. Inside were updated reports indicating that the property transfer had been temporarily halted pending a formal review. There were also notes suggesting that the prospective buyers were reconsidering their involvement due to the uncertainty. The knowledge did not fill me with triumph. Instead it brought a sober recognition that decisions once made in haste could echo far beyond their original intent. The next morning, Ethan suggested we visit the house together. Snow still blanketed the neighborhood when we arrived, muffling the usual sounds of suburban life. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the familiar path, noticing how the frost clung to the edges of the mailbox and the wind chimes Robert had installed years ago. The front door remained locked, yet the sight of it stirred a quiet determination in my chest. This place was more than a financial asset. It was a testament to decades of effort, resilience, and hope. As we stood there in the pale winter sunlight, Ethan spoke softly about potential outcomes, about the importance of patience while the review process unfolded. I nodded, understanding that resolution rarely arrived overnight. Still, I felt a growing sense of balance return with each measured step forward. The narrative that had once been dictated by assumption and silence was gradually giving way to clarity and intention. When we drove away, I did not look back immediately. I focused instead on the road ahead, aware that the coming days would demand both courage and restraint. Somewhere within the shifting landscape of loss and possibility, I was beginning to reclaim something far more enduring than property. I was reclaiming the quiet authority to shape my own story. The review process stretched into weeks that felt both heavy and strangely illuminating. Each morning I woke with a clearer sense of purpose, no longer drifting through the uncertainty that had once clouded my thoughts. Ethan's legal team continued to gather records, tracing every signature and timestamp with meticulous care. I accompanied them when necessary, sitting quietly in conference rooms where decisions were shaped not by emotion but by documented truth. There were moments when fatigue threatened to settle over me like a familiar shawl, urging me to accept whatever outcome might come simply to restore peace. Yet peace, I realized, could not exist without integrity. One afternoon we received confirmation that the property transfer had been formally suspended, pending a full investigation into whether I had been properly informed of the transaction's implications. The news arrived without fanfare, delivered in the measured voice of an attorney who had learned long ago that victories in his profession were rarely dramatic. I thanked him and ended the call, setting the phone down with deliberate calm. Outside the hotel window, winter sunlight reflected sharply off the river, turning its surface into a ribbon of silver. Later that evening Linda requested to meet in person. We chose a quiet cafe near the courthouse, its warm lighting and soft music creating a neutral space where neither of us held the advantage of familiarity. She arrived precisely on time, her expression composed but tinged with a vulnerability she could no longer conceal. We spoke for nearly an hour, our conversation unfolding in careful layers. She acknowledged that her decisions had been driven by ambition as much as concern, that she had mistaken efficiency for compassion. I listened without interruption, recognizing the courage it took for her to articulate what had long remained unspoken. When she asked what I intended to do if the review ruled in my favor, I paused before answering. "I will decide what is best for my future," I said quietly. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. The weeks that followed confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. The authorization forms had been presented during a period when my emotional vulnerability had impaired my ability to grasp their full significance. The sale was deemed invalid, and arrangements were made for the prospective buyers to withdraw without penalty. On the morning I returned to the house, snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of green grass beneath the fading winter. I unlocked the front door with hands that no longer trembled, stepping into rooms that felt both familiar and newly reclaimed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the quiet air. I walked slowly from one space to another, touching the banister Robert had polished himself, the kitchen counter where countless meals had been prepared, the piano that still held the echo of songs once sung by children who believed their world was unbreakable. Ethan stood by the doorway, offering neither congratulations nor advice, simply witnessing the moment with respectful distance. I understood then that reclaiming the house was not the true resolution of this journey. The greater victory lay in rediscovering the strength to define my own boundaries. That evening I sat at the dining table with a notebook open before me, drafting plans for the years ahead. Some rooms would be renovated. Others would remain unchanged as quiet reminders of where I had been. Linda visited a few days later, her steps hesitant but sincere. We spoke not of blame but of accountability, of the fragile balance between independence and connection. Our relationship would require time to rebuild, yet the foundation was no longer built on silent assumptions. As spring approached, the maple tree in the front yard began to bud, its branches reaching toward a sky washed clean by recent storms. Standing beneath it one morning, I realized that loss had stripped away illusions, but had also revealed unexpected allies, forgotten resilience, and the enduring value of dignity. The future remained uncertain as it always had, but I faced it with a steadiness that came not from property regained or conflicts resolved, but from the quiet knowledge that my story was once again mine to write.